The conference room went quiet the instant the little hand pushed the heavy glass door. Then everyone noticed that a child had no business in a billionaire meeting. Then everything changed. Mateo Rivera was 10 years old and small enough to still carry the scent of the street in his clothes. He wore a faded soccer jersey 2 sizes too big and sneakers with paint flecks. He had learned American Sign Language at a neighborhood center because Eleanor Quinn would sometimes sit on the bench outside the high-rise and sign the weather with a laugh, and Mateo had wanted to say hello. Eleanor Quinn was the billionaire in the room's mother, 82 years old and profoundly deaf, shielded by wealth but repeatedly left out of decisions that directly shaped her life. An envelope tucked in Mateo's backpack had a grocery list, a subway card, and a folded paper where he wrote numbers that mattered to him. What he would do next would expose a breach of fiduciary duty and a cascade of choices that would force an audit and reshape a company's approach to accessibility and integrity. The carpet was low and dry under the shoes. The air smelled faintly of coffee and hand lotion. The projector hummed. There were stacks of glossy binders, the glint of a fountain pen resting like a tool of authority, the thin metallic tang of a nameplate. The chair at the head of the table had the name Caldwell on a brass plate and a man in a tailored suit who expected agreement. Mateo walked, hands slightly trembling, and the room watched the improbable actor move toward one of the most powerful tables in the city. What happens when a child understands what adults pretend not to notice? The apartment where Mateo lived was on the edge of a neighborhood where cranes met small corner stores, where the subway rumbled, and a friend in the next building practiced the piano late at night. Mateo's mother, Maria, cleaned the building that housed Quinn Holdings. Maria had worked there for 12 years. She had set out Mateo's clothes the night before, punching a hole in a sock with a fingernail to mark the left one. She taught him to count money by folding tiny bills into labeled envelopes so he would not forget the names of who they were saving for. At breakfast, she would point to Eleanor's picture on the intercom screen and tell him to be careful, but to be brave. Mateo had never been inside the glassy conference room before. He had ridden the elevator with Maria once and watched Eleanor sign with slow, theatrical fingers as if she were telling a secret. That small theater of motion had taught him to look for patterns. Context came quickly. The board was meeting to vote on a redevelopment plan that included changes to the independent trust that paid for Eleanor's caregivers and for her apartment modifications. Mateo had never been inside the glassy conference room before. He had ridden the elevator with Maria once and watched Eleanor sign with slow, theatrical fingers as if she were telling a secret. That small theater of motion had taught him to look for patterns. Context came quickly. The board was meeting to vote on a redevelopment plan that included changes to the independent trust that paid for Eleanor's caregivers and for her apartment modifications. The billionaire's son, Oliver Quinn, who rarely visited, was present by video only and wore a tie but not the full weight of seeing his mother every day. Oliver's lawyer had drafted a memorandum that shifted parts of the trust funds into a new holding company purportedly to streamline tax liabilities. The memo used words like optimization and asset consolidation and included a section that recommended cutting costs by standardizing caregiver hours and removing a clause that required documented interpreter services for Eleanor. There was a line item titled Infrastructure Efficiencies that read like spreadsheet shorthand but meant fewer hours and less in-person interpreting. The room treated those words like neutral math. Mateo had been watching Eleanor's hands for weeks and had memorized her signs for pain and for joy. When he saw the clause, he slid between the elevator doors that morning and up 2 floors undetected until he stood at the glass. Before the interruption, a brief portrait of the participants would matter. There was Martin Caldwell, the chief executive, a man with a slow cadence and a practiced smile, who liked to call difficult choices bold. He had a reputation for efficiency and a board that trusted numbers more than testimony. There was Denise Park, the general counsel, who liked to keep legal exposure abstract and who had drafted many disclaimers. There was Richard Cole, the chief financial officer, who read forecasts like prayer and who did not like surprises. There was Claire Simmons from compliance, who kept a thick binder of policy that rarely left her side. There was Aisha Rahman, a director, who had come up through community development and who sometimes pushed back with stories of streets she grew up on. There was Ramon Torres, head of security, who had once been a building superintendent and recognized Maria in the hallway from a dozen small courtesies. There was Jamal Reed, a young associate from an outside law firm who typed fast and listened faster. There was Maya Ortiz, a freelance journalist who had been waiting by the elevators for a comment and who carried an old notebook that smelled like rain. Each of these names would end up in the narrative as witnesses, as participants, and as people who could choose to make things right. Mateo's backstory needed room. He was an only child. Maria had immigrated in her 20s with trade skills and a promise to send letters home. Mateo's father was not part of the picture. Maria worked double shifts to keep the rent current and to fund Mateo's after-school ASL class at a local community center run by Pastor Luis. Mateo learned ASL so he could volunteer to play board games with people at a senior center on weekends. The elder who most loved his company was Eleanor Quinn, who wore scarves and always fed him a cookie she said was too crumbly for her teeth, yet she fed him anyway. Mateo, he had learned to translate not out of duty to wealth, but out of affection. He had saving goals written in a small notebook, one page wholly for soccer balls, and another page for a scholarship to a summer science camp he wanted so badly that he set aside coins under the bed. He had a practice of touching his own throat when he ate and to check he was breathing when he felt anxious. He had been mocked once in middle school for being the kid who signed in the cafeteria, but he had also been thanked later by a transfer student for showing the language meant he was not alone. His backstory told of small rituals his mother taught him, folding envelopes, labeling them with names like rent and food and emergency, and sometimes with the word future. That discipline made him slow down and notice sequences in speech and in paperwork. The antagonist required depth too. Martin Caldwell had begun his career as a turnaround expert. He prided himself on numbers and had an executive posture that pretended personal matters were distractions. He had a childhood that gave him little patience for softness. He had risen by restructuring and had a board that rewarded courage to prune. He saw family details as variables to optimize. He believed in fiduciary duty in the abstract, yet often interpreted duty as maximal return for shareholders. He had set a late night to code a new policy with the CFO that would compress certain benefits into a centralized fund to free up capital. He convinced himself that the trust could be modernized without harm. He would later insist he acted within legal boundaries, but morally he underestimated the human cost of removing an interpreter guarantee for a deaf beneficiary. He had advisors who praised his decisiveness, and critics who would say he mistook efficiency for integrity. His backstory was one of ascension, and of a mind trained to cut what felt inefficient, a mind that habitually classified people into line items until someone made it personal. Now the scene in the conference room where the decision was to be rubber-stamped unfolded with sensory detail. The projector light was cool and clinical on the wall. The room tasted of espresso and metallic pens. Leather chairs creaked. Claire Simmons fanned a paper with a nervous laugh. The silence hovered like the low wind before a storm. Martin Caldwell spoke in the measured tone of containment. He tapped the table. He said, "We will save considerable expense and streamline caregiver hours and ensure tax efficiency." Aisha frowned. She said, "You cannot blindside a beneficiary or remove promised access." Richard said, "The numbers are compelling and we can justify the consolidation." Denise said, "Legally this is defensible if we amend the trust properly." Jamal said, "We should flag the language about interpreters as optional." Mateo stood at the door. Mateo touched his necklace, a small cross Maria had tied for him, and a scrap of paper in his pocket. He signed first to Eleanor, who sat with a blank face, her hands quiet on her lap. He then stepped forward and spoke. Dialogue Scene 1 with required depth and exchanges. The board had to be captured with 10 to 12 back-and-forth exchanges to maintain the scene's rhythm. Mateo said, "Excuse me, may I speak?" Martin said, "This is not for children. Please step outside." Mateo said, "My name is Mateo Rivera. I know Eleanor." Aisha said, "Mateo, what are you doing here?" Mateo signed, and then said, "Eleanor cannot rely on lip reading all the time. She needs an interpreter." Denise said, "We have considered that, and there will be arrangements." Mateo said, "The draft removes guaranteed interpreter hours." Richard said, "That is one line in legal language we can revise." Mateo said, "Legal language is what they hide things in." Maya said, "Hold on, can he show us what he means?" Mateo took a printed page he had slipped in. He pointed to a clause and said, "This says infrastructure efficiencies, but it cuts care." Martin said, "Who gave you that document?" Mateo said, "I found it in an envelope Maria left by the security desk." Ramon said, "Maria, what did you do?" Maria said, "I bring Eleanor's mail sometimes because the intercom confuses me, and I put it by the desk for her." Jamal said, "These are board materials, not for the public." Aisha said, "If this harms a person, we should stop." Claire said, "We need counsel to interpret any change." Denise said, "Council will review, but a vote is scheduled." The room's demeanor changed. The initial skepticism turned into a test. The first public challenge had to be humiliating for the protagonist, yet reveal competence. Mateo was small, and yet he had something the room lacked, which was the lived testimony of the person who would be affected. He signed to Eleanor. She blinked slow, then formed the sign for question, and then why. Mateo signed back to her with deliberate gestures. The sensory environment was thick. The rustle of paper as binders were opened, the scratch of a pen on a legal pad, the humidity of breath held in a domino of shoulders. Mateo's fingers trembled, then steadied. He described in simple words and in signs how the clause would reduce interpreter hours from 20 hours a week to 6 and fold in remote sessions that were unreliable. He talked about the fatigue that came from lip reading, the way hands of a caregiver could become a lifeline in a noisy emergency. Aisha's eyes filled, and she moved to the table. Martin's jaw tightened. A public test ensued. The board voted to table the motion until council could verify the legalities. Tension number 1 registered. This moment of highest tension needed 3 paragraphs, each rich and around 6 to 8 lines each and totaling 500 to 600. Characters overall when combined. Here are the tension paragraphs expanded. The first moment was the standoff when Mateo refused to be shushed and instead asked for Eleanor's rights to be read aloud and signed. The room went still as if glass had been poured into it. Mateo's voice was steady but small. His hands made quick insistences. For a few seconds, the only sound was the soft tap of a coffee cup being set down and a clock somewhere counting seconds like beads. People leaned forward. A tweet was thought about. A phone camera clicked. The power dynamic thinned. The second moment of tension was Claire Simmons flipping through pages and realizing the amendment used boilerplate that stripped named beneficiary protections. The words on the page seemed cold, then petrified into a public hazard. Noelle, the junior analyst, mouthed, "This is bad." And Denise, who had been a careful lawyer, felt the weight of precedent press between her shoulder blades. The microphones hummed. A staffer with a lanyard nervously adjusted the recording. An elevator ding in the hallway sounded loud and obscene. The third moment was external. Maya Ortiz, who had been waiting outside, pushed open a side door and in a whisper asked if she could ask one question for the record. Martin snapped at first, and then the room froze at the presence of a journalist. Cameras were not allowed, but the collective memory of the room knew reputations would be at stake. The air tasted like lemon cleaning solution, and the future tasted like a thought held in the mouth too long. Those 3 paragraphs collectively described tension moments and added texture. Mateo's demonstration of competence came next. He did not just accuse. He produced a simple spreadsheet he had copied onto a paper from the notice Maria brought. He had circled the line items, he had matched them to Eleanor's calendar of services, and he had memorized phrases of how the trust was being reallocated into an instrument called a consolidated holding. He could explain the difference between in-person interpreting and remote interpreting because his time with Eleanor taught him the nuance of visual rhythm. He explained the meaning of phrase fiduciary duty in plain language. He connected a line item to a caregiver cut and to the increased fall risk for an elderly deaf person experiencing less direct assistance. The technical description that explained how a trust amendment could shift beneficiary protections required a paragraph of precise language and then a short, accessible explanation. Here is a technical description of process and forensics that is about 300 characters. The trust amendment process required the board to approve a restatement, which would consolidate accounts. A restatement can redirect discretionary distributions and redefine beneficiary entitlements. Proper audit trails require notarized amendments and recorded minutes, but if those clauses remove express guarantees, it amounts to a material change that fiduciaries must disclose and justify to avoid breach of duty. After Mateo's clear statement, Jamal Reed asked a pointed question about source documents. That question sparked an internal investigation. Claire Simmons called for an immediate forensic review of the drafts. An auditor from outside the company, Claire Simmons said, will compare timestamps and email chains. There would be a formal request for the original trust documents and for transactional records tying transfers to related party companies. Mateo sat while adults muttered about procedures and constraints. The auditor's name would later be Claire Simmons, refer to an outside firm called Lindstrom & Co., and the first technical steps were to secure documents in a chain of custody and to begin an audit trail. The investigative climax required the discovery of evidence and a reveal that stunned the room. The team of investigators uncovered a series of emails showing that a shell company had been referenced in a side memo, and that language about reducing interpreter services had been inserted in a late revision without sign-off by all trustees. A forensic review showed redactions and timestamps inconsistent with a clean approval process. The evidence included wire transfers and a vendor list with a company registered at a residential address. The discovery was revealed in a public reading. Maya Ortiz recorded the moment on her phone. The room heard the word fraud for the first time. Dialogue. Scene 2 during the revelation needed another round of 10 to 12 exchanges to show the emotional and legal confrontation. Martin said, "This is circumstantial at best." Claire said, "The timestamps indicate edits after the meeting, and a new vendor was added without procurement approval." Jamal said, "The language removing a guaranteed interpreter is a material change, require full trustee consent." Denise said, "We had counsel's approval." Maya said, "We have emails with counsel's approval that predate the edits." Richard said, "Who benefited?" Mateo said, "The holding company appears connected to a vendor that reduced costs by cutting services." Aisha said, "There are names here linked to a property registered to a relative of one of the executives." Ramon said, "We need to secure the building's mail and Maria's rounds." Maria said, "I found envelopes that did not belong to Eleanor." Claire said, "We will issue a hold on any transfers." Martin said, "You are talking about reputations." Aisha said, "You are talking about a woman who cannot be left out." Evidence and testimony were then fed into an immediate legal process. A complaint would be filed with state regulators, an internal suspension of certain executives would be authorized pending inquiry, and the board would vote to freeze transfers. The language of removal of interpreter services was now not a theoretical line item, but proof of disregard for accessibility commitments and a possible breach of fiduciary duty. Legal counsel prepared an emergency statement. A prosecutor would later open a parallel inquiry into possible fraudulent transfers. The fall of the antagonist and immediate consequences had to be measured. Martin Caldwell was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. 2 executives were suspended. The board voted to appoint an independent trustee to review all amendments affecting beneficiary protections across trusts. News outlets picked up the story and the hashtag for accessibility trended. The company issued an apology and a promise to review policies. The billionaire's son, Oliver Quinn, called his mother and said he was coming back from a business trip which he had canceled repeatedly over years. He walked into the senior center where Eleanor sat and signed that he was sorry. The consequences included a criminal referral and internal compliance overhaul. There were immediate offers of support. A local nonprofit offered a scholarship for Mateo to attend a national ASL leadership program, and a university clinic offered to review the company's accessibility infrastructure free of charge. Those offers were tangible steps toward reintegration. The community reacted in named ways. The 5 to 8 secondary characters played public roles after the hearing. Maya Ortiz published an exposé and organized a town hall where Maria, Mateo, and Eleanor were invited to speak. Jamal Reed filed a formal white paper on trustee obligations. Claire Simmons led the audit and handed over a report. Pastor Lewis organized a fundraiser to support elderly residents in the neighborhood and to push for accessible design in public housing. Aisha Rahman convened a coalition of community leaders to demand binding accessibility language in all local trusts. Ramon Torres testified about mail handling procedures, and Maria Alvarez became an advocate in her own right for better protections for residential staff. A university professor, Dr. Priya Nair, provided pro bono legal support to Eleanor and drafted a model clause guaranteeing interpreter hours for life. Together, these people formed a network of witnesses and actors who made the abstract into public pressure. One of the high points in the narrative was a public hearing where Mateo again spoke, but this time with the legal weight of evidence behind him. The hearing had a different rhythm. There was the smell of corridor coffee, the buzz of fluorescent lights, a sound of chairs scraping. Mateo's speech was short, and then he answered questions from a prosecutor and from the board's counsel. The hearing was televised locally, and clips circulated. Mateo was asked simple, direct questions, and he answered in a pattern of sign, then voice, so viewers could see both forms. The hearing revealed the human cost of procedural shortcuts in ways that spreadsheets never could. At approximately 1/3 into this narrative, and after that first major demonstration of Mateo's competence, the script must pause for a community invitation to engage. If you are feeling anger or hope now, you are not alone. Have you seen someone break expectations like this elsewhere? Where did it happen? Who was that person, and what changed? Tell us in a few sentences so others can learn. Your comment may help someone find resources or inspire someone to speak up. We are building a living archive of stories about ordinary people who forced institutions to be more accountable. Now, let's return to what happened after the hearing. The climactic legal unraveling required a detailed procedural description to make the stakes understandable. The independent audit took 6 weeks. Forensic accountants traced transfers and flagged related party transactions. The legal team issued a 30-day injunction to prevent any reallocation of trust funds. A formal complaint alleged breach of fiduciary duty and failure to honor explicit beneficiary protections. The regulator opened an administrative case, and the board agreed to amend the trust to include enforceable accessibility provisions. Within a month, the company agreed to fund a community accessibility endowment and to underwrite lifelong interpreter hours for Eleanor and any future death beneficiaries from the same trust pool. A moment of moral climax occurred when Oliver Quinn walked into the senior center and signed to his mother. There was a small awkwardness. He could sign slowly, but not with the fluent intimacy of someone who had learned for love. Eleanor smiled and signed back. She forgave him. The public saw a scene of reconciliation and accountability. But the legal climax had teeth. A prosecutor issued subpoenas. An early plea negotiation was threatened. And an independent corporate monitor was appointed to report monthly on compliance with new accessibility standards. An internal memorandum was leaked showing the words, "We must increase perceived inclusion." But the audit recommended specific, measurable steps, including mandated hours of in-person interpreting and a fund to pay for accessibility upgrades in all residential facilities owned or managed by the company. After the dust settled, the community and family transformation unfolded with immediate measurable outcomes. Offers of employment and educational opportunities came to people who had been peripheral. Maria was offered a supervisory role in the building's operations with a living wage and benefits. Mateo received a full scholarship to the ASL leadership camp he had dreamed about and a laptop donated by a technology nonprofit so he could study. Eleanor received binding guarantees of interpretation and a renovation that made her home safer. The company allocated a fund of $500,000 to upgrade accessibility in its properties and to create a scholarship program for bilingual social workers. Neighborhood clinics received support to train interpreters, and local nonprofits were given grants to build social infrastructure. The epilogue must be long and measured and carry measurable numbers and emotional closure spread over 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. 1 month later, Mateo's life had new contours. He had meetings with a community organizer and with a scholarship officer, who walked him through summer camp options. Maria was enrolled in a workers' rights seminar and had a lawyer helping renegotiate her contract. The building's staff room had a new bulletin board about accessibility training. Mateo visited Eleanor several times a week, and their routines included reading the Sunday paper together with Eleanor signing headlines and Mateo reading aloud. Community counted 50 volunteers who had signed up to participate in neighborhood accessibility audits, and a local news station ran a segment that drew donations to a fund that had already accrued $20,000 in individual gifts. 3 months later, the independent audit had published a preliminary report showing irregularities in document control and third-party vendor selection, and the regulator had opened a formal inquiry. 2 executives had resigned, and 1 faced a formal complaint. The company had announced a new policy to require explicit beneficiary language in all trusts and a multi-year budget line dedicated to accessibility retrofits across their managed properties. Mateo had been invited to speak at a city council meeting about the importance of inclusion and had chair space in a youth civic panel. The scholarship program announced it would award 10 full scholarships for ASL leadership to local students over the next 5 years. Community partners reported increased trust, and early interviews had turned into a larger investigative series led by Maya Ortiz. 6 months later, the legacy became clearer and more durable. The Independent Monitor's interim report showed compliance improvements and recommended a new template for beneficiary protections that had been adopted by 2 other large local foundations. The regulatory case had settled with a consent order requiring the company to pay a fine and to fund long-term accessibility measures. Eleanor now had a formal care plan with 24-hour access to qualified interpreters for scheduled medical visits and a new internal complaints process available in accessible formats. Maria had received back pay and a promotion and was training staff on inclusion practices, which she taught with pride. Mateo had co-authored a short guide for young advocates about speaking up for people who cannot be heard, and he had a small scholarship fund named in his honor that would support volunteer interpreters to train undergraduates. The neighborhood reported a measurable increase in calls to a municipal hotline for accessibility issues that the city had just launched and which was partially funded by the company's new grant. Throughout this journey, the vocabulary of audit, interpreter, accessibility, integrity, community, scholarship, investigation, evidence, testimony, empathy, fiduciary, infrastructure, inclusion, complaint, reintegration threaded the narration like a theme. The story was about the formal mechanics of law and money and about the intimate choreography of hands moving meaning. It was about a child who stood between a mother and a process and forced an institution to reconcile its numbers with the lives they affected. There were moments of viral resonance that defined public memory. The initial entry through the glass door, the challenge in front of executives, the technical reading of a clause by a 10-year-old, the envelope opened on a security desk, and finally the epilogue, where a billionaire publicly accepted responsibility, were sequences that sparked conversation and policy changes. People used those viral moments to lobby for statutory language requiring express accessibility guarantees in trusts and in contracts. Corporate benefit plans. NGOs used the case as a teaching example. University law clinics adapted the model clause Dr. Priyanera drafted into their curriculum. This is not a story about vilifying one person as much as it is about how institutions can become impermeable to empathy until someone who lives at the margins translates grievance into evidence. Mateo did not set out to become a public figure. He wanted a summer science camp and to make sure his friend Eleanor could keep her interpreter. The ripple effects were legal audits and a compliance overhaul and a fund for scholarships and a small human dignity restored. In the weeks after the hearing, donations poured into community nonprofits and volunteer interpreter rosters swelled. The city instituted a training certification for property managers about accessibility obligations. The company's board changed its charter to require a community representative on matters affecting beneficiaries. Those are measurable changes. If you like this story, please consider subscribing to follow more investigations that combine lived experience with forensic facts. If you want to take action, here are 3 pragmatic steps you can take. Contact your local representative and ask for legal language protecting accessibility in private trusts. Donate to community interpreter training programs, and share stories like this one to create social pressure for institutional accountability. Tell a neighbor. Teach a child to notice the small signs that mean someone is being left out. The final image is quiet. Mateo sits on a bench outside the senior center and practices signing the word future with Eleanor. The light at dusk turns the glass of the building behind them into a mirror of the sky. People pass with shopping bags, and a delivery bike hums. The sound of shoes on concrete, the smell of fried empanadas from a corner cart, the scuff of a cane, and the bright plastic of a child's soccer ball make the scene tangible. Eleanor's fingers curl into Mateo's, and she signs, "Thank you." Mateo smiles and signs back the word he has written 1,000 times, in envelopes and in the margins of his school books, the word future. The camera lingers on their hands and on a small folded paper in Mateo's pocket that now reads scholarship with a line through it and the word camp underlined. The last line is simple and remembered. A child learned the language of someone who was too often left out, and in doing so, taught a city how to listen.